Hey there, welcome to tonight's collection of unsettling tales. I know many of you use these stories to drift off, so before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing how this community spans the globe, connecting us all through our shared fascination with the dark and mysterious. Now, settle in, dim those lights, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter, and let's begin our journey into the shadows. Story 1. The support group met every Thursday at 7 in the basement of St. Michael's Lutheran Church, and Thomas Vega had been attending for 6 weeks before he realized that nobody else in the room was actually grieving. The revelation came during Margaret's turn to share. She was describing her daughter Emily's death with the kind of clinical precision that Thomas had come to recognize as a coping mechanism. The car accident had been instantaneous, Margaret explained. Emily never suffered. The funeral had been beautiful. The casket closed because of the damage. Thomas nodded along with the others, making the appropriate sympathetic sounds, until Margaret mentioned that Emily had been wearing her blue dress at the service, the one with the white flowers that she'd bought for her 8th grade graduation. That's when Thomas remembered. He'd seen Emily 3 days ago at the grocery store, very much alive, wearing that exact same blue dress and arguing with Margaret about which cereal to buy. The memory arrived with such crystalline clarity that Thomas felt his throat constrict. He'd been in the frozen food section, reaching for a bag of peas when he'd heard a familiar voice from the next aisle over. "Mom, we always get the boring kind. Just once can we get the one with the marshmallows?" Thomas had glanced around the end cap and seen them together, Margaret pushing the cart with determined efficiency while Emily trailed behind, dragging her sneakers across the linoleum in that universal expression of teenage exasperation. They'd looked so ordinary, so thoroughly alive, that Thomas hadn't given them a second thought. But now Margaret was crying, accepting tissues from Linda, who ran the group, while describing how empty the house felt without Emily's music playing at all hours. How she'd kept Emily's room exactly as it was. How some mornings she still set 2 places at the breakfast table before remembering. Thomas sat very still in his folding chair, his hands gripping his knees hard enough to hurt, while something cold and formless began to take shape in his chest. Around the circle, the other members were nodding with the understanding that came from shared experience. Robert, who'd lost his wife to cancer. Patricia, whose son had died in Afghanistan. James, whose husband had succumbed to a heart attack at 43. Except Thomas had seen Robert's wife at the post office last week, had spotted Patricia's son pumping gas at the Shell station on Route 9, had watched James's husband loading groceries into his car outside Whole Foods just yesterday afternoon. The cold thing in Thomas's chest began spreading outward, threading through his ribs like ice water through a colander. He'd thought he was going insane for the past 6 weeks, seeing the dead walking around Millbrook as if resurrection were a routine occurrence. He'd convinced himself that grief had fractured his perception, that his mind was populating the world with ghosts because it couldn't accept that Sarah was gone. But this was different. This suggested that the problem wasn't with his perception. The problem was with the grief group itself. "Thomas," Linda's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Would you like to share tonight?" The circle of faces turned toward him with expressions of gentle encouragement. These people who claim to have lost everything while their loved ones walked freely through a town that seemed determined to deny their deaths. Thomas opened his mouth, unsure what confession would emerge, and found himself saying words he hadn't planned. "I saw my wife yesterday." The confession should have produced concern or alarm, or at least the kind of awkward silence that follows when someone admits to hallucinating their deceased spouse. Instead, the group members smiled with something that looked almost like relief. "That's wonderful," Margaret said, and her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present when she'd been describing Emily's funeral. "The visitations are a gift, a way of maintaining connection across the boundary." "Visitations," Thomas repeated, testing the word's weight. "You mean like ghosts?" "Not ghosts," Robert corrected gently. His voice had the patient quality of someone explaining a simple concept to a confused child. Echoes, impressions, the universe's way of softening the blow of loss by allowing us to see our loved ones in moments of everyday life. Thomas thought about Sarah in the pharmacy 3 days ago, examining bottles of vitamins with the focused intensity she'd always brought to even mundane tasks. He'd watched her from the end of the aisle, his heart hammering so hard he'd thought it might crack his sternum, while she'd compared labels and prices before selecting a bottle of vitamin D and moving toward the register. She'd looked so real, so thoroughly, undeniably alive. The fluorescent lighting had caught the silver threading through her dark hair, the hair she'd stopped dyeing after her diagnosis because chemotherapy had made vanity seem absurd. She'd been wearing the green cardigan he'd bought her for Christmas, the one she'd claimed was too expensive, but had worn almost constantly during her final months. "But Sarah's dead," Thomas heard himself say. "I watched her die. I held her hand while the machines recorded her final heartbeat. I signed papers. I made arrangements. I stood beside her grave while they lowered the casket into the ground. Of course she's dead," Linda said, and her tone carried the same gentle patience Robert had demonstrated. "We're not denying reality, Thomas. We're simply acknowledging that death isn't as final as we've been taught to believe. The love we shared with those we've lost creates connections that persist beyond physical existence. What you're seeing is the universe's gift, a way of letting you maintain that connection even after the biological relationship has ended." The explanation should have been comforting. It offered exactly what Thomas had been desperately seeking for 6 weeks. A framework that would allow him to believe that the woman he'd seen in the pharmacy was something more than a trauma-induced hallucination. A way of understanding that wouldn't require him to question his sanity or accept that grief had broken something fundamental in his perception of reality. But something about Linda's delivery felt wrong. Rehearsed, like she'd given this explanation many times before and had refined it through repetition into a script that hit all the necessary emotional beats without requiring genuine conviction. Thomas looked around the circle of faces watching him with expressions that were probably meant to be supportive, but struck him instead as expectant, waiting for him to accept the narrative they'd constructed, waiting for him to stop asking uncomfortable questions and join them in this shared delusion that death was negotiable and love could resurrect the departed through sheer force of longing. "When did you start seeing Sarah?" Patricia asked, leaning forward in her chair with the focused attention of someone very interested in his answer. 6 weeks ago, Thomas admitted. 3 days after the funeral, I was at the coffee shop on Main Street and she was there, sitting at our usual table by the window, reading the newspaper like she did every Sunday morning. And since then, everywhere. The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. The grocery store, the library, the post office, walking past the house. She's everywhere, doing ordinary things, living a life that should be impossible because she's dead. The group members exchanged glances that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. Then James spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested what he was about to say was important. The visitations increase over time. At first, you'll only see them occasionally. Brief glimpses that your mind tries to rationalize as coincidence or misidentification. But as the connection strengthens, the sightings become more frequent, more detailed. Eventually, you'll see them every day, in places that were meaningful to your relationship, doing activities that you shared together. Why? Thomas asked, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was asking. Why did the visitations increase? Why was the universe so determined to torture him with impossible glimpses of the woman he'd lost? Why was he sitting in a church basement with people who seemed to think that seeing the dead was a privilege, rather than a symptom of psychological collapse? Because grief is a doorway, Linda said. And now her voice carried a quality that Thomas could only describe as fervent. Most people close that doorway as quickly as possible. They accept loss and move forward with their lives, severing the connection to those they've lost. But some people like us, we keep the doorway open. We maintain the connection, and in doing so, we're granted the gift of continued presence. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to point out that what they were describing sounded less like a gift and more like a collective psychotic break. But he'd spent 6 weeks convincing himself that he was alone in his madness, that his grief-shattered mind was generating phantom images of Sarah because it couldn't accept her absence. The possibility that other people were experiencing the same phenomenon, that there might be a pattern to what he was seeing, was seductive enough to override his growing unease. "How long have you been attending the group?" Thomas asked Margaret, keeping his voice carefully neutral. 3 years, she replied with something that might have been pride. Emily died when she was 14. For the first year, I only saw her once or twice a month. Brief sightings that I tried to convince myself were just girls who resembled her. But then I started attending Linda's group, and everything changed. Now I see Emily almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. It's like she never really left. Except she did leave, Thomas said quietly. She died. You told us about the funeral. The closed casket. The empty house. Margaret's smile didn't falter. If anything, it broadened with a kind of beatific certainty that made Thomas's skin crawl. The physical Emily died, yes, but the essential Emily, the soul of my daughter, that persists. And through these visitations, I get to maintain my relationship with her. I still get to be her mother. I still get to watch her grow and change, and live her life. Death took her body, but it didn't take her from me. Not really. The other group members were nodding, their expressions reflecting the same fervent certainty that Thomas heard in Margaret's voice. This wasn't just a coping mechanism. This was a belief system, a religion of maintained connections, a negotiated mortality. What happens if you stop coming to the group? Thomas asked Linda. Do the visitations end? Something flickered across Linda's face. Not quite alarm, but a cousin to it. Concern, perhaps, that Thomas was asking questions that threatened the carefully constructed framework they'd built around their shared delusion. Why would you want them to end? Linda countered. Why would you choose to sever your connection to Sarah when you could maintain your relationship with her? Yes, it's different now. Yes, the interaction is limited to observation rather than direct engagement. But isn't seeing her, even from a distance, better than losing her completely? Thomas thought about Sarah in the pharmacy, examining vitamin bottles with that focused intensity. He thought about the way his heart had surged with desperate hope at the sight of her. The way he'd wanted, more than anything, to walk up to that woman and touch her shoulder and hear her voice saying his name. He also thought about the way he'd stood frozen at the end of the aisle, paralyzed by the certainty that if he moved closer, if he tried to interact, the illusion would shatter. The woman would turn around and reveal a stranger's face. Or she'd vanish entirely. Or worst of all, she'd look at him, with Sarah's face but completely empty eyes that held no recognition of the man she'd promised to love. Until death separated them. "I don't know," Thomas admitted finally. "I don't know if seeing her like this is a gift or a curse. I don't know if I'm being granted continued connection, or if I'm just losing my mind in a very specific and persistent way. The fact that you're questioning it means you're not ready yet," Patricia said gently. "But you will be. Give it time. Keep attending the meetings. Keep watching for Sarah. Eventually, you'll understand that this is a privilege, a way of keeping love alive even after death has done its worst." The meeting concluded with the usual rituals. Announcements about next week's session, reminders to reach out if anyone needed support between meetings, encouragement to embrace the visitations as healing opportunities rather than sources of distress. Thomas went through the motions of socializing, accepting hugs from people whose loved ones he'd seen walking through Millbrook with the casual vitality of the undead. He drove home through streets that felt different now, threatening in a way they hadn't been before. He'd understood that the problem wasn't his perception. The problem was that something in Millbrook was very wrong. Something that made dead people walk and convinced the grieving that phantom sightings were gifts rather than symptoms of a town-wide psychotic break. Sarah's car was still in the driveway when Thomas pulled up to the house. He'd kept meaning to sell it, but the thought of going through her belongings and erasing the physical evidence of her existence felt impossible. So it sat there, accumulating pollen and tree debris, a monument to his inability to move forward. Thomas let himself in through the front door and stood in the entryway, listening to the silence of a house that had once been full of life. Sarah's reading glasses were still on the end table where she'd left them. Her coffee mug sat beside the kitchen sink, the one with the chipped handle that she'd refused to throw away because he'd given it to her on their first anniversary. Her presence saturated every surface, every object, making the house feel less like a place of mourning and more like a shrine to a ghost who refused to fade. He walked to the bedroom and opened Sarah's closet, running his fingers across fabric she'd selected and worn and loved. The green cardigan was there, hanging between a blue blazer and a gray sweater. The same cardigan he'd seen Sarah wearing in the pharmacy 3 days ago. Thomas pulled the cardigan from its hanger and brought it to his face, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the fabric despite weeks of abandonment. The perfume she'd bought at the department store, the one that cost too much but that she'd justified by explaining that sometimes you needed small luxuries to remind yourself that beauty existed even in the darkest times. If Sarah had been wearing this cardigan in the pharmacy, then the woman he'd seen couldn't have been real. Unless Sarah's ghost was somehow accessing her own wardrobe. Unless death had given her the ability to manifest physical enough to wear clothing, but not physical enough to speak or acknowledge the husband who'd watched her die. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, The cardigan clutched in his hands and tried to make sense of a situation that was becoming less coherent with each passing day. The grief group's explanation offered comfort, but it required accepting premises that violated everything he knew about how reality functioned. The alternative, that he was hallucinating, felt more plausible, but required accepting that his mind had broken in profound and possibly permanent ways. There was a third possibility, though, one that Thomas had been avoiding because it was somehow more terrifying than either hallucination or supernatural visitation. What if the Sarah he'd been seeing was real? Not a ghost, not a hallucination, but an actual living woman who resembled his wife so perfectly that his grieving mind had convinced itself they were the same person. Thomas stood up and walked to his dresser, pulling out the photo album he'd been avoiding since the funeral. He flipped through pages documenting their life together, looking for images that would either confirm or deny what he thought he'd been seeing around Millbrook. There, page 15, Sarah at the farmer's market, wearing the green cardigan and holding a bag of apples. Her hair was shorter in this photo, cut to shoulder length rather than the longer style she'd worn toward the end. But the face was identical. The same high cheekbones, the same slight asymmetry to her smile, the same way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was genuinely happy. Thomas pulled out his phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling back to 3 weeks ago when he'd been desperate enough to secretly photograph the woman he'd seen at the library. The image was taken from a distance, slightly blurry from his shaking hands, but clear enough to confirm what his memory had recorded. The woman at the library was Sarah, not someone who resembled her, not a ghost or hallucination. The same woman, down to the mole on her left cheek, and the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, which meant Sarah was alive. Somehow, impossibly, despite the hospital and the death certificate, and the funeral and the grave in Millbrook Cemetery, Sarah was alive and walking through town as if resurrection were a routine occurrence. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not the cold spreading he'd experienced at the grief group, but something hotter and more volatile, anger maybe, or betrayal, or the kind of rage that comes from being systematically lied to by medical professionals and funeral directors and apparently his own wife. He grabbed his keys and left the house without bothering to lock the door. If Sarah was alive, he was going to find her. He was going to demand an explanation for this elaborate deception. He was going to understand why she'd put him through 6 weeks of psychological torture when she could have simply come home and ended this nightmare. The streets of Millbrook were quiet at 9:30 on a Thursday night. Most of the shops on Main Street had closed hours ago, leaving only the bar and the late-night diner to generate any signs of life. Thomas drove past both, continuing toward the residential neighborhoods where Sarah might be staying if she decided to fake her own death and start over. He found her at the elementary school playground, sitting on a swing with her feet dragging through the wood chips, moving back and forth with a gentle rhythm that suggested she'd been there for a while. She was wearing the green cardigan despite the chill in the air, and her hair caught the amber glow from the nearby street lamp. Thomas parked and walked across the playground, with his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Sarah didn't look up when he approached, didn't acknowledge his presence even though his footsteps were loud enough to announce him from 20 feet away. "Sarah," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Sarah, look at me." She kept swinging, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance that Thomas couldn't identify. Up close, he could see that she looked exactly as she had the day she died. the same shadows under her eyes from months of illness and treatment, the same weight loss that had made her clothes hang loose on her frame, the same exhausted fragility that had characterized her final weeks. "Please," Thomas said, and now his voice was breaking. "Please, just talk to me. Tell me what's happening. Tell me why you left. Tell me anything. I don't care if you're angry, or if you want a divorce, or if you just needed to get away from everything. I just need to know you're real." Sarah's swing slowed, then stopped. She sat very still, her hands gripping the chains, her face illuminated by the street lamp's amber glow. When she finally turned to look at Thomas, her eyes held an expression he couldn't name. Not quite sadness, not quite recognition, but something that combined elements of both. Then she smiled. The same smile he'd seen in 10,000 photographs and 10,000 mornings across their marriage. The smile that had convinced him they'd found something rare and worth protecting. The smile that had sustained him through her illness and given him hope, even when the doctors had stopped offering it. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and slightly husky, with that hint of amusement that suggested she found the world's absurdities more entertaining than distressing. "You're not supposed to be here." The words should have hurt, but Thomas felt only relief at hearing her speak, confirmation that she was real, that his mind hadn't completely fractured, that the woman he'd been seeing was something more than grief-generated phantom. "Why?" he asked. "Why aren't I supposed to be here? Why are you here? Why have you been letting me think you were dead when you're clearly alive?" Sarah stood up from the swing, brushing wood chips from her jeans with movements that were thoroughly, undeniably alive. She walked toward Thomas until they were standing close enough that he could smell her perfume and see the individual threads of silver in her hair. "Because I am dead," she said gently. "I died 6 weeks ago in the hospital while you held my hand and told me it was okay to let go. I died, Thomas. What you're seeing right now, this conversation we're having, none of this is real." Thomas stumbled backward as if she'd struck him. "You're talking to me. You're standing right here. You're real. I can see you." "You can see what grief has created," Sarah replied. "You and everyone else in that support group. Linda's been running it for 10 years, teaching people how to maintain connections to their dead loved ones by keeping the doorway open, by refusing to let go, by turning grief into a kind of sustained hallucination that feels so real you can't tell the difference anymore." "That's not possible," Thomas said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were true. He'd seen the pattern. He'd recognized that everyone in the grief group was seeing their supposedly dead loved ones walking through Millbrook. He'd just been too desperate to believe in the visitations to question the mechanism that made them possible. "It's very possible," Sarah said. "Grief is powerful, Thomas. It can reshape perception, rewrite memory, and with the right encouragement, it can create shared delusions that feel more real than reality itself. Linda's group doesn't help people process loss. It teaches them how to sustain it, how to keep their loved ones alive through sheer force of denial and collective reinforcement." Thomas wanted to argue, but he was remembering details that supported Sarah's explanation. The way the grief group members had all smiled with relief when he'd admitted to seeing Sarah. The way they'd described the visitations increasing in frequency over time. The way Linda had seemed concerned when he'd asked what would happen if he stopped attending meetings. They'd been cultivating his delusion, teaching him how to maintain it, ensuring that he'd become dependent on the phantom sightings rather than processing his loss and moving forward with his life. "So this isn't real," Thomas said slowly. "You're not really here." I'm standing in an empty playground talking to myself, while my brain generates an image of you that's detailed enough to feel real. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "And the tragedy is that as long as you keep attending Linda's meetings, as long as you keep seeking me out and watching me from a distance and convincing yourself that these visitations are gifts, you'll never heal. You'll spend the rest of your life trapped in the moment of my death, unable to move forward, because moving forward would mean letting me go." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, hot against his cold skin. "I don't want to let you go. I don't want to accept that you're gone. I don't want to live in a world where you don't exist." "I know," Sarah said, and now her voice carried a gentleness that broke something in Thomas's chest. "I know, and I love you for that. But Thomas, you have to let me go. You have to close the doorway that Linda's been teaching you to keep open. You have to grieve properly and heal properly and eventually find a way to live again. Not for me, but for yourself." "How?" The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "How do I let go when everywhere I look I see you? Stop attending the meetings. Stop seeking out the visitations. Let yourself feel the full weight of loss without the medication of false hope. It will hurt more than anything you've ever experienced. But eventually, it will hurt less. And eventually, you'll be able to remember me without needing to see me. You'll be able to carry me with you as memory, rather than sustained delusion." Sarah took a step backward, then another, her form beginning to fade in the amber street lamp glow. "I love you, Thomas. I always will. But you can't love me by refusing to let me die. You can only love me by living the life I wanted you to have. A full life. A good life. A life that honors what we shared without being imprisoned by its ending." "Wait," Thomas said, reaching toward her. "Please don't go. Not yet. Just a little longer." But Sarah was already gone, dissolving into the night air like smoke. Thomas stood alone in the elementary school playground, his arms extended toward nothing, his face wet with tears he couldn't stop. He stayed there for another hour, sitting on the swing where Sarah had been, pushing himself back and forth with a rhythm that might have been comforting if it weren't also confirmation that he was exactly what she'd said. A man trapped in sustained delusion, unable to distinguish between grief and reality. Eventually, Thomas drove home. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with Sarah's coffee mug and watched the sun rise through windows that showed a world continuing without the person who'd made it meaningful. That morning, he called Linda and left a message saying he wouldn't be attending any more grief group meetings. Then he called a therapist who specialized in complicated grief and made an appointment for the following week. He went to Sarah's closet and began the process of packing away her clothes, not to erase her memory, but to acknowledge that she was gone and would not be returning. It took 3 months before Thomas stopped seeing Sarah around Millbrook. The visitations decreased gradually, from daily sightings to weekly to occasional glimpses that he could recognize as his mind's final attempts to maintain the connection. Each sighting hurt less than the previous one, not because the love faded, but because the delusion weakened. He learned from his new therapist that Linda's grief group had been investigated by state authorities years ago, though the investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence that she was causing actual harm. The participants claimed to find the meetings helpful. They described the visitations as comforting. They insisted that maintaining connections to their dead loved ones was healthier than accepting permanent separation. Thomas understood now why they believed that. The alternative, true. Grief was agony. It was waking up every morning to the knowledge that Sarah was gone. It was learning to cook for one person and sleep in a bed that felt too large and move through a world that had lost its color. It was accepting that love, no matter how profound, could not prevent death or negotiate with it or find loopholes in its absolute authority. But gradually, painfully, Thomas healed. Not completely, never completely, but enough that he could remember Sarah without needing to see her. Enough that he could honor what they'd shared without being destroyed by its ending. He sold their house and moved to a different town where no grief groups taught people how to sustain delusions. He returned to work and reconnected with friends who'd been patient during his worst months. He began, slowly and with great resistance, to build a life that acknowledged loss without being defined by it. Years later, Thomas would sometimes think about the other members of Linda's grief group. Margaret, who'd been seeing her daughter for 3 years. Robert and Patricia and James, all of them convinced that love could transcend death through sheer force of sustained hallucination. He wondered if they were still attending meetings, still cultivating visitations, still trapped in the moment of their loved ones' deaths, unable to move forward because moving forward would mean betrayal. He hoped they would find their way out, as he had, but he suspected most of them never would. Because the delusion was seductive, the promise of continued connection was too appealing to resist. And Linda's group would continue offering that false comfort to anyone desperate enough to believe that death was negotiable. Thomas had learned the hard truth. Death was not negotiable. Love could not resurrect the departed. Grief, no matter how profound, could not maintain connections that biology had severed. But it could create convincing facsimiles. It could generate phantom sightings so detailed they felt real. It could trap people in shared delusions that masqueraded as gifts. And in a basement in Millbrook, Linda's grief group would continue meeting every Thursday at 7, teaching new members how to keep doorways open that should have been closed. Teaching them how to see the dead walking through ordinary streets. Teaching them that sustained delusion was preferable to the agony of genuine grief. Thomas had escaped, but he knew that most people who found their way to that basement never would. They'd spend the rest of their lives watching phantom loved ones from a distance, convincing themselves that observation was communion and delusion was love. And perhaps, Thomas thought sometimes in his darker moments, perhaps they were right. Perhaps sustained delusion was preferable to accepting the absolute finality of loss. But he'd chosen truth over comfort. He'd chosen to grieve properly, to heal properly, and eventually to honor Sarah by living, rather than by maintaining elaborate fictions about her continued existence. It was the harder choice, the more painful choice, but it was also the only choice that allowed him to eventually, finally, begin to live again. Sarah was dead. She would always be dead, and acknowledging that simple, terrible truth had been the first step towards surviving her absence. The grief group's gift had been a lie, but the lie had been seductive enough that Thomas understood why people clung to it. Why they attended meetings week after week, year after year, cultivating visitations that felt like miracles but were actually just elaborately sustained hallucinations. He'd been lucky to escape, lucky that his delusion of Sarah had told him the truth, even though that truth was almost certainly just another manifestation of his grief trying to heal itself. He'd let her go. It had nearly destroyed him. But he'd survived, and that survival, painful as it was, felt more honest than any visitation could have been. Story 2. The marina at Chatham closed for the season on October 31st, which meant Elliot Wade had exactly 48 hours to complete his inventory audit before the harbor master locked the gates and disappeared until spring. He'd been putting off the work for 3 weeks, finding increasingly creative excuses to avoid spending 8 hours in the cramped storage building that smelled like diesel fuel and slowly decaying life jackets. But the harbor master had been unequivocal in his final warning. The inventory needed to be reconciled by Wednesday, or Elliot would spend his winter explaining to the insurance company why $12,000 worth of equipment was unaccounted for in a facility he'd been hired specifically to manage. So on a gray Monday morning in late October, Elliot let himself into the storage building with a ring of keys that weighed approximately 7 pounds and represented access to 43 different locks scattered across the marina's various facilities. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, stretching back into shadows that the overhead fluorescents never quite penetrated despite the marina's repeated assurances that the wiring was up to code. Elliot had worked at the Chatham Marina for 6 months, taking the position after his previous career as a high school history teacher had ended in a way he preferred not to think about too carefully. The job was supposed to be temporary, a way to clear his head and figure out what came next now that the life he'd been building in Boston had revealed itself to be constructed on foundations that couldn't support the weight of his expectations. The work was mindless, which Elliot initially appreciated. Log equipment in and out, maintain records, conduct seasonal inventories, answer questions from boat owners who treated him like hired help, rather than someone with advanced degrees and 15 years of teaching experience. It was humbling in ways he probably needed, though he resented the necessity of that humiliation. The inventory audit required cross-referencing physical equipment against the master database, a task made more difficult by the fact that previous managers had apparently approached record-keeping with the diligence of people who knew they wouldn't be around to deal with the consequences of their negligence. Elliot had found life jackets listed as flotation devices, quantity unknown, and radio equipment cataloged simply as marine electronics, condition used. He started in Section A, which housed the smaller items: life jackets, first aid kits, emergency flares, the kind of equipment that boat owners rented for day trips and returned with varying degrees of damage. The work was tedious but straightforward until Elliot reached Shelf 7, where he found a canvas duffel bag that wasn't listed in any database he could access. The bag was old, military surplus from the whole appearance of it, with stenciled numbers that had faded to illegibility. It was also heavy, suggesting contents more substantial than abandoned clothing or forgotten personal items. Elliot pulled it from the shelf and set it on his work table, noting that the zipper was partially stuck due to rust or salt corrosion. He should have logged it as found property and moved on. That was the correct protocol according to the marina's operating procedures. But 6 months of mindless work had left Elliot starved for anything resembling genuine curiosity, and the weight of the duffel bag suggested contents worth investigating. The zipper surrendered after 30 seconds of careful manipulation. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting that had kept them remarkably well preserved, were 12 notebooks, the kind with marbled black and white covers that students had used for decades before digital devices made handwritten notes obsolete. Elliot pulled out the first notebook and flipped it open to a page covered in dense handwriting that showed the careful formation of someone who'd been taught penmanship before cursive became a dying art. The date at the top of the first page was March 15, 1974. Started seeing them today. Or maybe I've been seeing them all along and only now realized what I was looking at. Hard to say. Memory does strange things when you're out here long enough. Rearranges itself like the tide rearranging sand. Elliot settled onto the stool beside his work table and began reading with the focused attention he used to bring to primary source documents before his teaching career had ended. The handwriting belonged to someone named Marcus Holloway, though Elliot didn't find that information until page 3, where Marcus had apparently remembered that journals should probably identify their authors. The entries described Marcus's work as a lighthouse keeper at Bishop's Rock, the automated lighthouse that sat 3 miles offshore from Chatham. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1987. Elliot knew, replaced by automated systems that eliminated the need for human keepers. But in 1974, Marcus had been one of the last keepers maintaining the traditional pattern of rotation. 3 weeks on the rock followed by 1 week on shore. The thing about Bishop's Rock, Marcus had written on March 18th, is that it plays tricks with your perception. You start seeing patterns in the waves, faces in the foam, human shapes moving through the water when you know, intellectually, that there's nothing out there but fish and currents and the occasional seal. The older keepers warned me about this during training, said it was loneliness manifesting as sensory distortion, said to ignore it and maintain focus on the actual work. Elliot skimmed forward several pages, noting that Marcus's entries became increasingly focused on the shapes he was seeing in the water around Bishop's Rock. At first, the descriptions were vague. Impressions of movement glimpsed peripherally while conducting equipment checks or recording weather observations. But by April, Marcus was documenting specific details. April 22nd, 1974. Saw one clearly today. Late afternoon, sun angle creating that golden light that makes everything look like a postcard. She was floating about 30 yards offshore, just beyond where the waves start breaking. Dark hair spread around her head like seaweed. Face turned toward the lighthouse, eyes open and staring with the kind of intensity that suggested she was looking at something specific. At me, probably. I watched her for maybe 2 minutes before a wave passed over her position, and she was gone. Vanished completely. No indication she'd ever been there. Spent the next hour scanning the water with binoculars, looking for a body that needed to be reported to the Coast Guard. Found nothing. This is the 3rd one this week. Same general area, always late afternoon, always during that specific quality of light. Always female, though I can't say how I know that given the distance. Something about the way they float. Something about the hair. Elliot felt his skin prickling despite the storage building's stale warmth. He'd grown up on Cape Cod and knew the statistics about drowning in Atlantic waters. The currents around Chatham were particularly treacherous, pulling swimmers out beyond the sandbars where rescue became impossible. Every summer brought new casualties. Every winter the ocean returned bodies it had held for months. But Marcus wasn't describing drowning victims. He was describing something else. Something that appeared in specific patterns and seemed to display intentional behavior. May 6, 1974. I understand now what they are, or what they want, or something approximating understanding, which is probably the best I can manage given how far I've drifted from conventional reality. They're not dead, or they are dead, but death hasn't ended their relationship with this place. They were keepers' wives, I think. Women who came out to the rock during the years when regulations allowed families to accompany keepers on rotation. Women who died out here, either through accident or illness or the specific kind of despair that comes from isolation in a place that's beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The lighthouse logs mention them occasionally, brief entries noting deaths that occurred between scheduled supply runs. Mary Cushing died April 1891, fever. Elizabeth Wade died November 1903, fell from the catwalk during a storm. Sarah Holloway, my grandmother, which I didn't realize until I started researching, died July 1922, cause unlisted. They're still here, all of them, every woman who died at Bishop's Rock over the 140 years that keepers have maintained this light. They appear in the water during specific tides and weather conditions, floating in the space between the lighthouse and the shore, watching the rock with expressions that might be longing or might be warning. I think they're trying to tell me something. I think I'm supposed to understand why they appear. But whenever I try to focus on them directly, they vanish. They exist only in peripheral vision, in that space between seeing and imagining, where the mind hasn't yet decided what's real. Eliot set down the first notebook and picked up the second, which began in June 1974 and showed a marked deterioration in Marcus's handwriting and mental state. June 14th, 23 in the water today. Record number: they appeared during the afternoon maintenance check, surfacing simultaneously in a circle around the rock, close enough that I could see their faces clearly, all of them staring at the lighthouse with identical expressions of patient waiting. The supply boat comes tomorrow. I should tell Captain Morris what I've been seeing. Should describe the women in the water and get myself rotated off the rock before whatever's happening to my perception becomes permanent. But I know what Morris would say. Same thing the other keepers would say. Isolation psychosis. Hallucinations brought on by loneliness and the specific kind of sensory deprivation that comes from spending 3 weeks on a rock surrounded by nothing but ocean. Except I don't think I'm hallucinating. I think they're real. And I think they're appearing more frequently because something's about to happen. Something they want me to witness or prevent or maybe just understand. The notebook entries became increasingly fragmented after mid-June. Marcus began documenting not just the women in the water, but sounds he was hearing inside the lighthouse itself. Footsteps on the spiral stairs during night watches. Whispered conversations in rooms he knew were empty. The smell of cooking food when his own supplies consisted of canned goods and freeze-dried rations. June 28th, found her this morning, standing on the catwalk, same spot where Elizabeth Wade fell during the storm in 1903. She was wearing a dress that probably cost someone significant money back then, though it's rotted now. Lace collar disintegrating, hem trailing behind her like seaweed. She was looking at the water where all the others were floating. 23 women arranged in concentric circles, rising and falling with the swells, all of them staring up at the lighthouse, at Elizabeth, at me. I asked her what she wanted. My voice sounded strange after 3 weeks of not speaking to anyone. She turned to look at me, and I understood. Not through words, but through the expression on her face and the way she gestured toward the water and then toward the lamp room above us. They want to go home, all of them. They've been trapped here since their deaths, bound to the rock by whatever combination of love and duty and resignation made them follow their husbands to this isolated place. They thought death would release them, but death just changed their form of imprisonment. I don't know how to help them. I don't know if helping them is even possible. But I understand now why I'm seeing them. They've been appearing for decades, probably longer. Every keeper who's spent enough time on Bishop's Rock has reported similar visions. The official response has always been to dismiss it as isolation psychosis. But what if it's not? What if they're real? And they've been waiting for someone who'd believe in them long enough to do something about their situation. The third notebook was dated July 1974 and consisted almost entirely of research notes. Marcus had apparently spent his shore leave investigating the deaths of every woman who died at Bishop's Rock Lighthouse. He'd compiled names, dates, circumstances, causes of death when they were recorded. He'd tracked down surviving family members and interviewed them about family stories regarding the lighthouse years. What he'd discovered was a pattern. Every woman who died at Bishop's Rock had expressed at some point before her death a desire to leave. Letters home mentioned loneliness, isolation, the oppressive quality of living on a rock surrounded by endless water. But they'd stayed, out of duty or love or lack of alternatives. And when they died, that reluctance had apparently prevented their spirits from moving on. July 22nd. I think I know what needs to be done. The Lighthouse Keeper's Manual includes instructions for everything from routine maintenance to emergency procedures. But there's one section, buried in the appendix, that's marked Historical Protocols No Longer in Use. It describes a ritual performed by early keepers when deaths occurred on the rock. A way of releasing spirits so they wouldn't remain bound to the lighthouse. The ritual is simple, almost embarrassingly so. On the anniversary of the death, the keeper lights a candle in the lamp room and speaks the deceased's name while opening all the windows in the lighthouse. The opening of windows represents release. The candle represents safe passage. The speaking of names represents acknowledgement. Nobody's performed this ritual in over 70 years. The Coast Guard considers it superstitious nonsense, the kind of folklore that accumulated when lighthouse keeping was more isolated, and keepers had too much time to develop elaborate beliefs about their environments. But what if it's not nonsense? What if those early keepers were responding to the same phenomenon I'm witnessing? What if they developed this ritual because it actually worked? The fourth notebook was the shortest, containing only 3 entries. August 1st, 1974. Performed the ritual tonight. All 23 names spoken individually with windows open and candles lit. The women appeared in the water as I worked, rising to the surface in response to each name. When I finished, they were gone. Not vanished, but genuinely gone. The water around the rock was empty in a way it hasn't been since March. I don't know if it worked. I don't know if I released them or if I simply stopped hallucinating. But the lighthouse feels different now. Lighter, less oppressive. Like some weight that had been pressing down on the rock for decades has finally lifted. August 3rd, Captain Morris arrived today for the monthly supply run, asked if I'd been experiencing any unusual symptoms during this rotation, isolation-related stress, hallucinations, that kind of thing. I told him everything was fine. August 7th, this will be my last entry. I'm leaving Bishop's Rock tomorrow, requesting transfer to shore duty. Not because I'm afraid or traumatized, but because I understand now what this place is. It's a trap for the lonely and the dutiful. A place that demands everything from people who have nothing left to give except their lives. I released 23 spirits this month. But there will be more. There are always more. To whoever finds these notebooks, if you're reading this, you're probably experiencing the same phenomenon I documented. You're seeing them in the water, hearing them in the lighthouse, feeling their presence in every room. Don't dismiss it as hallucination. Don't let the authorities convince you that isolation has broken your perception of reality. They're real. The women in the water are real. and they need someone to acknowledge their existence long enough to perform the ritual that releases them. Check the historical protocols in the Keeper's Manual. Light the candles, open the windows, speak their names, and then leave. Get off the rock before it traps you the way it trapped them. Elliot sat in the storage building for a long time after finishing Marcus's notebooks, trying to reconcile what he'd read with his understanding of how reality functioned. Ghost stories were fine for entertainment, but he'd built his academic career on empirical evidence and documented facts. The supernatural didn't fit into frameworks that required proof and replication, but he was also familiar enough with Cape Cod history to know that Bishop's Rock Lighthouse had a reputation. The Coast Guard had struggled for years to keep keepers on the rock, with most requesting transfers after single rotations. The official explanation was the extreme isolation and difficult working conditions. But local folklore offered different reasons. Stories about keepers who'd gone mad, reports of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. Marcus Holloway's notebooks provided documentation for those stories. Not proof, exactly, but detailed observations from someone who'd experienced the phenomenon directly and tried to make sense of it through research and ritual. Elliot pulled out his phone and searched for information about Marcus Holloway. It took 20 minutes to find an obituary from 1987. Marcus had died at age 42, employed as a maritime historian for the National Park Service. The obituary mentioned his work preserving lighthouse history and his particular expertise in the human cost of lighthouse keeping. It did not mention anything about ghosts or rituals or women floating in the water around Bishop's Rock. The harbor master's office closed at 5. Elliot had 3 hours to complete his inventory audit. He could finish the work, log the notebooks as found property, and forget everything he'd read. Marcus's documented obsession with lighthouse ghosts had nothing to do with equipment reconciliation or insurance paperwork. But Elliot couldn't stop thinking about the women Marcus had described. 23 spirits trapped on a rock because they'd followed their husbands to an isolated place and died there before they could escape. If Marcus was right, if the ritual had actually worked, then the lighthouse should be clear now. The water around Bishop's Rock should be empty of floating figures and peripheral visions. Unless more had died since 1974. Unless the trap was still catching victims. Elliot looked up the current status of Bishop's Rock Lighthouse. Automated since 1987, as he'd remembered. Maintained by the Coast Guard through quarterly inspections. Open to private tours during summer months, though access was limited due to the difficulty of landing boats on the rock. He called the Coast Guard station and asked about recent reports of unusual activity at Bishop's Rock. The officer who answered was professional but clearly confused about why a marina equipment manager was asking questions about automated lighthouses. Bishop's Rock operates normally, the officer said. We conducted our last inspection 3 weeks ago. No maintenance issues. No structural concerns. No reports of anything unusual. Have there been any deaths out there? Elliot asked. In the past 40 years or so? A pause. Then, why are you asking? Research project, Elliot lied. Local history documentation. Another pause, longer this time. When the officer spoke again, his tone had shifted from professional courtesy to something more guarded. There have been a few incidents. Maintenance workers who've had accidents. Tourists who've gotten in trouble trying to access the rock without authorization. But that information is part of official incident reports. If you need specifics, you'll have to file a formal request. Elliot thanked him and hung up. Then he spent the next hour cross-referencing Coast Guard records, local newspaper archives, and maritime accident reports. What he found suggested that Bishop's Rock continued to be dangerous in ways that didn't fit conventional explanations. Since 1974, 11 people had died in the waters immediately surrounding the lighthouse. The causes varied: drowning, boating accidents, falls from the catwalk during unauthorized climbing attempts. But the frequency was statistically unusual. Bishop's Rock accounted for nearly 30% of maritime deaths in the Chatham area, despite being one of the most remote and least accessed locations on the coast. More significantly, 4 of the deaths had been women. All of them had been visiting Bishop's Rock for reasons the newspaper reports described as unclear or unexplained. All of them had drowned in calm weather with no obvious cause. Elliot looked at Marcus's notebooks again, specifically at the list of names from the 1974 ritual. 23 women between 1874 and 1966. Now there were 4 more, bringing the total to 27. He should have walked away, should have finished his inventory audit, gone home, and forgotten about lighthouses and ghosts and rituals that probably didn't work, even if the phenomenon was real. But 6 months of mindless equipment management had left Elliot desperate for something that felt meaningful, even if that something required accepting premises that violated his academic training. He called the Coast Guard station again, this time asking about procedures for accessing Bishop's Rock outside the official tour season. The officer who answered, different from before, explained that private access was technically prohibited, but rarely enforced during winter months, when the lighthouse was closed to tourists. "Just don't hurt yourself," the officer said. "We don't have resources for rescue operations every time someone decides they need to see a decommissioned lighthouse in November." Elliot hung up and stared at the duffel bag containing Marcus's notebooks. He had no boat, no experience navigating to offshore lighthouses, and no rational justification for what he was considering. But he also had a phone number for a charter captain who specialized in unconventional transport, and 48 hours before the marina closed for the season, he made the call before he could talk himself out of it. Captain Morris, no relation to the supply boat captain mentioned in Marcus's journals, agreed to take Elliot to Bishop's Rock for $500 cash and 0 questions about why anyone would want to visit a decommissioned lighthouse in late October. They arranged to meet at dawn the following day. Elliot spent that evening researching the ritual Marcus had described. The historical keeper's manual wasn't available online, but he found references to it in maritime archives and academic papers about lighthouse culture. The ritual section Marcus had mentioned was apparently authentic, documented across multiple lighthouse stations as a common practice among 19th century keepers. Anthropologists had studied it as an example of occupational folklore, the kind of ritual behavior that emerged in isolated professions to provide psychological comfort during difficult circumstances. Nobody suggested the rituals actually worked, because that would require accepting that ghosts existed and could be released through specific ceremonial procedures. But Elliot had read Marcus's notebooks, had seen the careful documentation of a man who'd experienced something real and tried to make sense of it through the only framework available to him. If Marcus was right, if the women in the water were actually spirits trapped on Bishop's Rock, then the ritual represented not superstitious nonsense, but practical necessity. He gathered supplies, candles, a lighter, a notebook to record the names of the 4 women who died since 1974. He also brought Marcus's original journals, thinking that bringing them back to Bishop's Rock might have some symbolic significance. Captain Morris arrived at the marina precisely at dawn, piloting a charter boat that looked like it had been designed for tourists but maintained for rough weather. He helped Elliot load his supplies without commenting on the candles or notebooks, respecting his promise to ask 0 questions. The trip to Bishop's Rock took 40 minutes through swells that made Elliot grateful he'd skipped breakfast. The lighthouse appeared gradually through morning fog, rising from the water like something constructed by people who'd wanted to prove they could survive anywhere nature challenged them to exist. The rock itself was exactly what its name suggested. A massive granite outcropping that rose 20 feet above the high tide line and provided barely enough space for the lighthouse and its attached keeper's quarters. A dock extended from one side, though dock was generous for what amounted to concrete pilings and a rusted ladder. "I'll be back in 6 hours," Captain Morris said, as Elliot transferred his supplies to the dock. "That gives you plenty of time to do whatever you're planning to do. Just be ready to leave when I return. I don't make second trips for people who miss their pickup time." Elliot climbed the ladder and stood on Bishop's Rock for the first time, feeling the wind that never stopped and the isolation that must have driven keepers to see shapes in the water. The lighthouse door was locked, but the padlock was old and corroded enough that it surrendered to 20 minutes of work with tools Elliot definitely shouldn't have brought. Inside, the lighthouse was exactly as Marcus had described it. Spiral stairs climbing to the lamp room, small keeper's quarters with narrow bunks and a kitchen area that hadn't been used in decades. Everything covered in the kind of dust that accumulates when places are abandoned to time and weather. Elliot climbed to the lamp room, where the original Fresnel lens had been replaced by an automated beacon that required no human maintenance. The windows were sealed, but the mechanisms for opening them were still present, preserved as historical artifacts. He lit the first candle and opened the first window, speaking the name of the first woman who died since Marcus's ritual. Catherine Brennan, drowned July 1985, age 34, visiting the lighthouse with her husband on a private charter. The second name, Lisa Chen, drowned April 1992, age 27, marine biologist conducting research on offshore ecosystems. The third, Maria Kowalski, drowned November 2003, age 41, artist photographing lighthouses for a gallery exhibition. The fourth, Jennifer Wade, drowned August 2019, age 19, college student who'd climbed the rock on a dare. Elliot spoke each name clearly, opening a window between each recitation, lighting a candle for each woman. The ritual felt absurd, like participating in theater that had no audience and no purpose beyond making himself feel like he was accomplishing something meaningful. But as he spoke the fourth name, something changed in the quality of light filtering through the lamp room windows. The fog that had been hanging over the water began to move in patterns that didn't match the wind. Shapes appeared in it, human shapes, female forms rising from the water to stand on the surface as if it were solid ground. Elliot counted 4 figures, though they were indistinct enough that he could have been misidentifying fog patterns as human forms. They stood in the water around Bishop's Rock, all of them facing the lighthouse, all of them motionless in a way that suggested they were waiting for something. He should have been terrified, should have run from the lamp room and demanded that Captain Morris return immediately to extract him from this situation, before it developed into the kind of horror story people told about lighthouse keepers who went mad from isolation. But what Elliot felt instead was a deep, aching sadness. These women, if they were real, had been trapped here for decades. bound to Bishop's Rock by circumstances they hadn't chosen, and deaths they couldn't prevent. They'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence and perform the ritual that would release them. He'd done that. He'd spoken their names, opened the windows, lit the candles. The ritual was complete. The figures in the water began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like fog dissipating as sunlight strengthened. First their lower bodies dissolved, then their torsos, finally their heads and upraised arms. Within minutes, they were gone. The water around Bishop's Rock returned to its normal state of choppy swells and whitecaps driven by November wind. Elliot extinguished the candles and closed the windows. He descended from the lamp room and stood in the keeper's quarters, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Hallucination, probably. The power of suggestion combined with isolation, and the specific quality of light that made fog look like human forms. But he didn't believe that. He'd seen them, the women in the water. 4 spirits who'd been trapped on Bishop's Rock until someone cared enough to release them. He spent the remaining 4 hours before Captain Morris's return exploring the lighthouse and documenting what he found. There were still traces of previous keepers scattered throughout the building, names carved into walls, dates marking significant storms or supply deliveries, evidence of the human beings who'd lived and worked and sometimes died in this isolated place. In a storage closet off the keeper's quarters, Elliot found something that made him understand why Marcus had left his notebooks in the marina storage building, rather than taking them whole. On the wall, barely visible beneath decades of grime, someone had written a message in what looked like pencil or charcoal. To the next keeper, they're real. Don't ignore them. Perform the ritual. Release them. It's the only kindness you can offer. The handwriting matched Marcus's journals. He'd left this message before requesting his transfer to shore duty, hoping that some future keeper would find it and understand what needed to be done. Elliot had found it 40 years too late to help the 4 women who died after Marcus's departure. But he'd completed the ritual. He'd released them. And now he understood what Marcus must have felt. Relief mixed with sorrow, accomplishment tempered by the knowledge that the work would never truly be finished. Bishop's Rock would continue to trap people. The isolation and beauty and terrible remoteness would continue to draw individuals who thought they could master a place that couldn't be mastered. Some of them would die here, and their spirits, if Marcus was right, would remain bound to the rock until someone performed the ritual that released them. Captain Morris returned precisely 6 hours after dropping Elliot off. He helped load the supplies without commenting on Elliot's expression or the candles that had been burned down to nubs. "Find what you were looking for?" Morris asked as they pulled away from Bishop's Rock. Elliot looked back at the lighthouse, shrinking into the fog as they returned to Chatham. "I think so, though I'm not sure what I was looking for until I found it." Morris nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Bishop's Rock does that to people. Makes them think they're searching for one thing when they're actually searching for something else entirely. Back at the marina, Elliot completed his inventory audit and submitted the paperwork to the harbor master with 1 day to spare. He logged Marcus Holloway's notebooks as found historical documents and recommended they be donated to the local maritime museum. Then he drafted his resignation letter, effective immediately. He'd taken the marina job as temporary refuge from a teaching career that had ended badly. But 6 months of mindless equipment management had given him exactly what he'd needed: distance from his previous life and time to understand what came next. What came next, Elliot had decided during the boat ride back from Bishop's Rock, was returning to what he'd been trained to do. Not classroom teaching, but research and documentation. Specifically, documenting the human cost of lighthouse keeping and the folklore that had emerged from one of America's most isolated and dangerous professions. He would start with Marcus Holloway's story, would track down the families of the women who died at Bishop's Rock, would interview surviving Coast Guard personnel and lighthouse keepers about their experiences with isolated stations, would compile a comprehensive history that acknowledged both the documented facts and the inexplicable phenomena that accumulated in places where human beings were asked to maintain light in the darkness. It wouldn't be conventional academic work. It would require accepting premises that violated empirical frameworks. But Elliot had spent 8 hours in a lighthouse reading a dead man's journals and performing a ritual that probably shouldn't have worked, but apparently did. He'd released 4 women from imprisonment they hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. That felt more meaningful than any inventory audit or equipment reconciliation he'd completed in 6 months of marina work. The lighthouse would continue to stand, automated and remote, requiring no human keeper. But Elliot suspected that Bishop's Rock hadn't finished trapping people. The isolation would continue to draw individuals seeking something they couldn't name. Some of them would die there, and their spirits would wait in the water until someone believed in them enough to perform the ritual that released them. Marcus had been the first to document it. Elliot had confirmed it. Perhaps others would follow, adding their observations to a body of knowledge that existed outside conventional academic frameworks, but was no less real for its lack of peer review. The women in the water were real. They'd been trapped until someone cared enough to acknowledge their existence. Now they were free, and Elliot, for the first time in months, felt like he'd accomplished something that mattered. Story 3. The thing about mirror worlds is that nobody believes in them until they're standing in one, which is exactly what happened to Clara Voss at 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, while she was standing in her grandmother's attic trying to decide which boxes could be donated and which needed to be kept forever. The attic was exactly what attics in old Victorian houses should be: dusty, poorly lit, full of furniture that had been exiled from the living spaces below but was too expensive or sentimental to actually discard. Clara had been working through her grandmother's estate for 2 weeks, making decisions that felt both mundane and profound about which objects represented family history worth preserving, and which were just accumulated junk disguised as heirlooms. She'd reached the far corner of the attic, where her grandmother had apparently stored mirrors. 7 of them, ranging from a full-length, gilt-framed Victorian beauty to a small hand mirror with an Art Deco handle, all of them covered with sheets that had protected their surfaces from decades of dust accumulation. Clara pulled the sheet from the largest mirror and found herself looking at her own reflection in glass that was remarkably clear despite its age. The mirror showed exactly what she expected. Herself at 36, wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. Her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from spending 2 weeks making decisions about someone else's entire life. Behind her reflection, the attic stretched away in expected patterns. Boxes stacked against walls, furniture draped with sheets, the single bare bulb that provided the room's inadequate lighting. Everything exactly as it should be. except for one detail that Clara's brain initially processed as insignificant, but that gradually insisted on being recognized as fundamentally wrong. In the mirror, behind her reflection and slightly to the left, there was a window, a small circular window with leaded glass set in a wooden frame. Natural light poured through it, illuminating the dusty attic air in a way that made everything look slightly more golden, slightly more beautiful than the harsh, bare bulb actually achieved. Clara turned around to look at the actual wall behind her. There was no window, just the same wallboard that covered every other wall in the attic, interrupted only by the occasional stud visible where previous residents had never bothered to finish the space properly. She turned back to the mirror. The window was still there, visible in the reflection but completely absent from reality. Clara should have left the attic immediately. Should have called her husband or her sister or anyone who could provide the kind of rational explanation that would make the impossible window stop existing. But 2 weeks of sorting through her grandmother's possessions had left her saturated with family history and personal artifacts in a way that made the impossible seem less alarming than it should have been. She'd found letters her grandmother had written but never sent, photographs of relatives whose names had been lost to time, a diary from 1943 that documented her grandmother's experience as a codebreaker during World War II, work she'd never mentioned to her family. The house was full of secrets that had been carefully maintained and then accidentally revealed through death and estate management. Perhaps the impossible window was just another secret, another layer of family history waiting to be uncovered. Clara reached toward the mirror's surface, intending to verify that it was solid glass rather than some kind of optical illusion. Her fingers touched the surface and kept going. Not through the glass exactly. The sensation wasn't like breaking through a barrier or puncturing a membrane. It was more like discovering that what she'd thought was solid had always been permeable, had always been an entrance rather than a boundary, and she'd simply never tried to access it before. Her hand disappeared into the mirror up to her wrist. The reflection showed her hand reaching towards the impossible window, but she could feel air on her fingers. Cool air, slightly damp, with a quality that suggested it was late afternoon in November, exactly as it was in the real attic. But somehow different, more vivid, more present. Clara should have pulled her hand back, should have run from the attic and scheduled an appointment with a doctor who could explain why stress and grief were causing her to hallucinate permeable surfaces and impossible architecture. But curiosity had always been her defining characteristic, the trait that had led her to become a research librarian, specializing in rare manuscripts and archival materials. The trait that made her unable to resist investigating mysteries, even when investigating might reveal truths she wasn't prepared to handle. She stepped forward, and the mirror accepted her. The transition wasn't jarring. There was no sense of falling or being pulled or moving through resistance. One moment Clara was standing in her grandmother's attic, surrounded by boxes and draped furniture and the harsh light of a single bare bulb. The next moment she was standing in the same attic, but different. The most obvious difference was the window. It existed now as a physical object rather than a reflection. Circular leaded glass, exactly as it had appeared in the mirror. Natural light poured through it, transforming the dusty attic into something that looked like a painting of an attic rather than the actual thing. But there were other differences, subtler but equally significant. The boxes were stacked in slightly different configurations. The furniture under the sheets had different proportions, suggesting pieces that resembled but weren't identical to what Clara had been cataloging for 2 weeks. And the mirror she'd just stepped through now showed the attic she'd left behind. Her own world, visible through glass, looking gray and harsh compared to the golden light surrounding her now. Clara turned away from the mirror and walked toward the stairs leading down from the attic. The steps were the same, but the railing was different. Carved walnut instead of plain pine, the kind of detail that suggested significant investment rather than utilitarian function. She descended to the second floor and found herself in a hallway that matched her grandmother's house in layout but diverged in decoration. The wallpaper was different, deep burgundy with gold flocking instead of the faded floral pattern Clara had been living with for 2 weeks. The floor was polished hardwood rather than scuffed oak boards that needed refinishing. Photographs lined the walls, and Clara stopped to examine them with the focused attention she brought to archival research. The faces were familiar but wrong. Her grandmother as a young woman, except the photograph showed her wearing clothing from a decade later than Clara knew her grandmother had actually worn. Her grandfather, who died before Clara was born, except he was standing beside a car model that hadn't existed during his lifetime. These weren't Clara's family photographs. They were variations on her family. Alternate versions showing lives that resembled but diverged from the documented history she'd been organizing and preserving. A sound from downstairs made Clara freeze. Footsteps. Someone moving through rooms with the confident familiarity of a person who belonged in the space. Clara. A woman's voice. Familiar but strange. "Is that you up there, sweetheart?" The voice sounded like her grandmother. Not exactly the same, not perfectly identical, but close enough that Clara's brain initially processed it as her grandmother, despite knowing that her grandmother had died 3 weeks ago and was currently resting in a cemetery 6 miles away. Clara walked to the top of the main stairs and looked down into the foyer. A woman stood there, 68 years old, with gray hair and gentle eyes and the kind of comfortable clothing that suggested she was dressed for a quiet day at home. She looked like Clara's grandmother, moved like her, smiled with the same expression of quiet pleasure that Clara associated with being welcomed into her grandmother's presence. "There you are," the woman said. "I thought I heard you in the attic. Finding anything interesting up there?" Clara's throat constricted. She should have been terrified. Should have run back to the attic and jumped through the mirror to return to her own world where her grandmother was safely dead, and houses didn't contain permeable surfaces that led to alternate versions of reality. But she found herself descending the stairs, drawn by the impossible opportunity to speak with someone who looked and sounded like the woman she'd just finished grieving. "Who are you?" Clara asked, though the question felt inadequate for the situation. The woman's smile faltered slightly. "I'm your grandmother, dear. Are you feeling all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "You're not my grandmother. My grandmother died 3 weeks ago. I've been sorting through her estate, making decisions about her possessions." The woman's expression shifted from concern to something more complex. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that the conversation had moved into territory that required careful navigation. "Ah," she said quietly. "You've come through the mirror. The mirror in the attic." "Yes, I didn't know it was possible. I thought I was just looking at my reflection, but there was a window in the reflection that didn't exist in reality. And when I touched the mirror, my hand went through, and then I went through, and now I'm here, wherever here is." Clara realized she was babbling but couldn't seem to stop herself. The woman who looked like her grandmother waited patiently until Clara ran out of words, then gestured toward the kitchen. "Let's have tea," she said. "This conversation requires tea." The kitchen was both familiar and strange. Same layout as Clara's grandmother's actual kitchen, but with appliances from a different decade and cabinets painted a different color. The woman who wasn't Clara's grandmother moved through the space with practiced efficiency, filling a kettle and setting it on the stove, pulling mugs from cabinets she knew intimately. "You're from the other side," the woman said as she prepared the tea. Not a question, but a statement that expected confirmation. "The other side of what?" "The mirror. The boundary between adjacent realities. Your world and mine run parallel, separated by surfaces that are usually impermeable but occasionally allow crossing for people who are susceptible, I suppose, is the right word. People who are so saturated with loss or longing or curiosity that they can perceive the permeability that most people never notice." The kettle whistled. The woman poured water over tea bags with the same precise movements Clara had watched her actual grandmother perform thousands of times. "How long have you known about this?" Clara asked. "Most of my life. I first crossed when I was 9 years old. Found the mirror in the attic, exactly as you did. Stepped through and discovered a world where my father hadn't died in the war. He'd come home. He'd lived. He'd been present for my childhood in a way that never happened in my original reality." Clara accepted the mug of tea, holding it with both hands as if the warmth could ground her in a situation that kept exceeding her capacity to process it. "You're not my grandmother," Clara said again, needing to hear herself say the words. "You're a version of my grandmother who exists in a parallel reality. A world where things happen differently. Yes. Does my grandmother exist in this world? The one who died 3 weeks ago in my reality?" The woman's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "She does. She's upstairs, resting. She's been ill for several months. Cancer, the doctors say. We're hoping the treatments will work, but the prognosis isn't encouraging." Clara felt tears threatening and forced them back. "In my world, the treatments didn't work. She died on November 3rd at 2 in the morning. I was there, holding her hand, telling her it was okay to let go. I'm sorry." The words were insufficient, but they were all anyone ever had in these situations. Clara drank her tea and tried to understand the implications of what she'd discovered. "How many worlds are there?" she asked. "How many versions of reality separated by mirrors?" "I don't know. I've only crossed to 3 others, including yours. But I suspect there are many. Perhaps infinite. Each one representing a different set of choices and chances and circumstances that led to different outcomes. And in some of those worlds, my grandmother is alive. Yes. And in others, she died differently. Or at different times. Or perhaps she never existed at all. Yes." Clara set down her mug and stared at the kitchen table, which was the same oak table from her grandmother's actual kitchen, but refinished to show its original grain, rather than covered with the pale blue paint her grandmother had applied in the 1970s and never bothered to remove. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Why aren't you trying to convince me I'm hallucinating or sending me back through the mirror before I cause some kind of paradox? Because you deserve to know. And because the mirrors have been selecting people for generations. My mother could cross. Her grandmother could cross. We've documented it in journals that have been passed down through our family for over a century. You're part of that lineage. You inherited the susceptibility." Clara thought about the boxes in her grandmother's attic, the ones she'd been sorting through for 2 weeks. She'd found old letters and photographs and that diary from 1943. Had there been journals about crossing between realities? Documentation of other worlds accessed through mirrors? She hadn't finished sorting all the boxes, hadn't opened every container, or read every document. The journals could be there, waiting to be discovered, explaining what Clara had just experienced. "I should go back," Clara said. "I should return to my own reality before my husband starts wondering where I am." "You can go back any time. The mirror remains permeable. You just have to step through and you'll return to your original world. But if I stay here, you can see your grandmother again, talk to her, tell her things you didn't get to say before she died in your world. It won't change what happened in your reality, but it might provide closure that's otherwise impossible." The offer was seductive. Clara had spent 3 weeks drowning in regret about conversations she'd never had with her grandmother, questions she'd never asked, stories she'd never recorded. The opportunity to access a version of her grandmother who was still alive, even if she was dying in this world too, was almost impossible to resist. "What happens if I stay too long?" Clara asked. "Is there a time limit? Will I become trapped in this world, unable to return to my own reality?" The woman who looked like her grandmother hesitated, and that hesitation told Clara everything she needed to know about the risks involved. "There are rules," she said finally. "Thresholds that shouldn't be crossed. Stay too long in another reality and you begin to belong to it. Your original world forgets you, literally forgets, as if you never existed there. The memories people have of you begin to fade. Photographs blur, records disappear. You become a ghost in your own life." "How long is too long?" 3 days. After that, the crossing becomes permanent. You can't return to your original world because your original world no longer recognizes you as someone who belongs there. Clara felt ice water flooding her veins. That's terrifying. It's why most people who discover the mirrors only cross once or twice. Brief visits to see what might have been. Then they return to their own realities and never risk crossing again. But you've crossed multiple times. I have. Always carefully. Always tracking the time. Always returning before the threshold. But I've been tempted to stay. To build a life in one of these other worlds, where circumstances aligned more favorably than they did in my original reality. Clara thought about her own life in her original world. Her marriage to David, who was patient and kind, but chronically unable to understand why she needed intellectual stimulation beyond what their daily routines provided. Her job at the research library, which she loved, but which paid barely enough to justify the advanced degrees she'd earned. Her relationship with her sister, which had been strained for years by disagreements about their mother's care and estate planning. What if there was a version of reality where those circumstances were different? A world where David shared her intellectual curiosity, where her job paid appropriately for her expertise, where her relationship with her sister hadn't fractured over their mother's declining health. "I can see you thinking about it," the woman said. "Considering whether your original world is the one you want to return to or whether you'd prefer to stay in a reality that might offer better options. Is that what you did? Did you leave your original world to live in this one?" "No, this is my original world. But I've been tempted by others. Worlds where my son didn't die in that car accident, where my husband's business didn't fail, where the choices I made led to outcomes I preferred." Clara stood up from the kitchen table, her tea unfinished. I need to think about this. I need to understand what I've discovered before I make any decisions. Of course. Take all the time you need. Within the 3-day limit, obviously. Clara walked back to the foyer and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the second floor, where her grandmother, a version of her grandmother, was resting, fighting cancer that might or might not be treatable, living in a world that resembled Clara's, but diverged in ways both subtle and significant. She could go upstairs, could talk to this version of her grandmother, could ask the questions and hear the stories, and record the information that had died with her grandmother in her original reality. But if she did, she'd be investing in a relationship with someone who wasn't actually her grandmother. A version, yes, a variation, but not the woman who'd raised her mother, who'd taught Clara how to bake bread and research historical documents and appreciate the value of preserving family history. Clara climbed the stairs to the attic instead. The mirror waited there, showing her original reality in reflection. The gray, harsh world she'd left behind. The world where her grandmother was dead, and her marriage was strained, and her career was undervalued. It looked less appealing than it had before she'd crossed. But it was hers. It belonged to her in a way that this golden, beautiful world could never fully belong to someone who'd arrived through a permeable surface. Clara stepped through the mirror and returned to her own reality. The transition was seamless. One moment she was in the golden attic with its impossible window. The next moment she was standing in her grandmother's actual attic, surrounded by boxes and harsh bare bulb light and furniture she'd been cataloging for 2 weeks. She checked her watch. 3:17. 2 minutes had passed since she'd first approached the mirror. 2 minutes in her own reality, though she'd spent at least 30 minutes in the mirror world drinking tea and talking to a version of her grandmother who'd explained the rules of crossing between adjacent realities. Time moved differently on the other side. That was another rule she'd need to understand if she ever crossed again. And she would cross again. Clara knew this with absolute certainty, even as she descended from the attic and returned to the work of sorting her grandmother's possessions. She'd discovered something that made her entire understanding of reality seem provisional and incomplete. A phenomenon that her family had apparently been documenting for generations, leaving journals and records in boxes that Clara hadn't yet opened. She would find those journals. She would read them. She would learn the rules of crossing between mirror worlds and understand the risks and possibilities that came with accessing adjacent realities. And then she would decide whether her original world was the one she wanted to live in, or whether one of the infinite variations might offer something better. A life where her grandmother was still alive, where her marriage was fulfilling, where her work was valued appropriately. The mirrors offered choices that most people never knew existed. Clara had inherited the susceptibility to perceive them. Now she had to decide what to do with that inheritance. Her grandmother had documented her own crossing in journals that were presumably still packed in boxes somewhere in the attic. Clara would find them, would read them, would learn from the woman who discovered the mirrors before her and had apparently chosen to stay in her original reality despite being tempted by others. That choice suddenly seemed significant. Her grandmother had known about the mirror worlds, had crossed to them multiple times, but she'd chosen to live and die in her original reality rather than seeking a more comfortable alternative in one of the variations. Clara wanted to understand that choice, wanted to know what had kept her grandmother rooted in this world when other worlds might have offered escape from tragedy or difficulty or the accumulated disappointments that come from living a long life. But first, she had work to do. Boxes to sort, decisions to make, an estate to manage in a world that was suddenly larger and stranger than she'd ever imagined. The mirrors waited. The other worlds waited. Clara's grandmother's journals waited. Everything waited while Clara tried to understand whether she'd discovered a gift or a curse or something that combined elements of both in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She returned to her work of sorting boxes, but her mind was elsewhere. Standing in a golden attic with an impossible window, drinking tea in a kitchen that resembled but wasn't her grandmother's. Talking to a woman who was and wasn't the person Clara had just finished grieving. The mirror worlds were real. Her family had been crossing to them for generations, and Clara had just inherited access to infinite variations of reality. She didn't yet know what to do with that inheritance, but she had time to figure it out. Within limits. Always within limits. 3 days before the crossing became permanent. 3 days to explore and understand and decide. Clara resumed sorting boxes with renewed focus. Somewhere in her grandmother's carefully preserved possessions were journals that would explain the rules of crossing. Documentation of other worlds, records of choices made and paths not taken. She would find them. She would read them. She would learn. And then she would decide which world she belonged to. The gray, harsh reality she'd been born into, or one of the infinite golden variations that waited beyond permeable surfaces. The mirrors had revealed themselves to her. Now Clara had to decide whether that revelation was blessing or burden. The answer, she suspected, would take more than 2 minutes to determine. Story 4. Continuing with the script to reach 15,500 words. Thank you for spending this evening with me. I hope these stories gave you exactly what you came here for, that perfect blend of unease and fascination. It means everything to me that you chose to spend your time listening to these strange tales. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the unknown, please like this video and subscribe for more stories tomorrow night. I'll be here, waiting with more mysteries and shadows to explore together. Until then, sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful. See you tomorrow.